Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Hanging On to Hope podcast. On today's show, we have Mary Demuth, author of the book, Love, Pray, Listen, Parenting Your Wayward Adult Kids with Joy. Mary is an international speaker, podcaster, and author of over 40 books. So welcome to the show, Mary.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
So I realized while reading your book that I am a lot like you. I could really relate to how you struggle with being hard on yourself, which I totally am too. So do you want to share some of the background and inspiration for writing this book?
Sure. Actually, the inspiration came not necessarily from my own experience, although that certainly came as well. But I was on a prayer loop with someone, and she constantly was talking about how her kids were forsaking her and not remembering her birthday, and her joy was completely catapulted by the behavior of her adult kids. And it just made me so sad. And her happiness or joy levels would rise and fall on whether her kids would do the things that she wanted them to do as adults. And so I think there is that thing that we parents have, this expectation thing that we have. And if our expectations are not met, then our joy gets stolen. And I feel like when the enemy attacks our adult kids, if he can take out them, that's one victory. If he can take out us and take us away from the ministry he has for us and the joy that we are supposed to experience, then he wins two victories. And so the reason I wrote this book is I don't want him to have two victories. And I have to believe that the presence of Jesus can bring me joy even when my expectations are shattered.
Yes, that's great. Well, hi, Mary. This is Brenda J. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Well, you write in the introduction how you love your adult children with everything inside of you, but how you love Jesus even more, and how that caused you to delve into this thorny topic of parental thriving after the empty nest. You say the truth is this: you can have joy even when your life or children or their choices don't go the way you planned. You talk about the nuances of loving your adult kids and letting that settle you into a new rhythm of love. Can you expound on that?
Sure. And it is true. I do love my kids so much. And my heart is pro them. I'm definitely pro them. But what I wanted to do in this book is, as I was praying about a metaphor, and usually every book I write has some sort of either scripture or controlling metaphor that holds or anchors the book. And this time I felt like the Lord said 1 Corinthians 13, where the love is and love is not is delineated. And so I did a deep dive into what actually is love. And we've, used those at wedding ceremonies, those particular verses, not realizing that Paul wasn't writing that about weddings. He was writing it about the dysfunctional Corinthian church and all their messy relationships. And so what better than to acknowledge that we can have messy relationships with our adult kids, and we can learn the ethic of love through what Paul unpacks there. And so every chapter is part of those phraseologies. Love is patient. What does that look like when you're loving your adult child? Love is kind. What does that look like? And so that was my impetus and my deep dive into the framework of the book.
Yeah, and I love that about the book. I mean, I end up having to read it pretty quickly, but it was so good. I mean, it really encouraged me just to be reminded of all those verses and then just, diving into it deeper like you were doing. That really, really encouraged me.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is I used that verse to try to love my ex-husband back in the days, but I never really thought about it. I mean, you should use it towards everything, but with my adult children, because of the triggers that we all have with each other after what we went through with the abuse, it is hard for me to love them the way it is to love a stranger or other people. It's a lot easier. But when you're triggered by things that happened in your past and past trauma, I really need to implement, the verse, love is patient, kind with my adult children too.
Mhm.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
that.
So you talk about how God the Father was the perfect father. He loved perfectly, he gave wisdom, and he walked alongside them. And yet Adam and Eve found the allure of the enemy so appealing than the wise whispers of their father. And you write how we can idolize the good old days, and I can totally relate to this, when our children lived happily under our roof, sang Bible songs, memorized verses, and attended church. You say the nostalgia of that era becomes a growth-stopping idol that poisons the joy of today's reality. And that's so true. So you say that we can swing the other way as well and forsake our Christian faith and beliefs. But you say, this is a quote from your book, grace without truth creates license. Truth without grace creates legalism. But there's a third way, holding the tension of both grace and truth. Grace for a sin-broken humanity and corrective truth for a humanity prone to stray. Parents of adult kids can find joy in the midst of both. Can you share more on that? That was so encouraging.
Yeah.
I'm really glad it was encouraging. It's definitely, I was writing this book because I needed it. And so I've been preaching it to myself this whole time. But it is, I don't come from a position of I'm the expert on this. I'm a fellow struggler in the parenting pit, so to speak. But it is true. Like in the book, I talk about a family whose one of their children came out and said that they had same-sex attraction. And that couple wanted to find other Christian parents who were walking through that. And almost all of those Christian parents that they talked to who had a similar situation had changed their theology based on their children's decision. And so the couple just had a hard time finding anyone that was kind of staying in their camp. And I know that that's a divisive issue. So I'm not trying to make the point that one is better than the other, but it is important that there is a way that I believe that truth and love can hold hands. You can still believe in truth and you can still love someone who makes decisions that you don't agree with. And unfortunately, our culture says that if you love someone, you applaud everything they do.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's the truth. I think what love is that you don't applaud everything people do, but you love them anyway.
Yeah.
And that to me is more radical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely. And that's like what podcast was at with Patrick Doyle, where the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries with someone, even though that doesn't seem loving.
Yeah.
So that kind of
That's
reminded me of that when you were talking about that. Now, you say your book is not a book about parenting in the later years, but a book about joyful living in the present tense. It's about exploring with Jesus, watching how he loved and modeled that for us. You say our lives are not over after discipling and training our children. They are only beginning. Can you share how we can have joy, purpose, and adventure in this new season?
I can, because I'm experiencing it right now. All three of my kids have flown the coop. They're paying their own bills. They live in their own houses. And my husband and I are in a new, era of freedom. And because of that freedom, we just have the capability of doing more ministry together. We have the capability of traveling more. We're no longer paying for college. So we've got a little bit more financial freedom. And which is so great.
Yeah.
And, that I think is, you've got this very spectacular time of life ahead of you where you are in that place of not being as tied down as before.
Yeah.
And I believe these are probably the most fruitful years of ministry ahead of us. And so for me, I'm frustrated with how the Western world has viewed people who are older than themselves and kind of relegate them to the back corners of church, when actually those senior saints they have so much to give. They have so much mentoring to do. And I'm not saying that we're going to have some sort of spectacular, splashy ministry, but that important ministry that happens in the one-on-one, I mean, that is so golden and people are longing for it. And so we have this opportunity to have joy in pouring into people one by one.
Yeah. And there's wisdom and experiences in going through these things that gets overlooked.
Very difficult for me to do ministry when my kids were little. And now it's my whole life focus is just living out the purpose and plan that God has for me, because I actually have the time now that my kids are grown up to do that. So I completely agree with what you're saying.
Well, thank you. I'm glad.
So we did a parenting program when our kids were babies called Growing Kids God's Way, which I'm sure people heard about. It was a set of formulas from how I remember it on setting up our kids to be structured and how it was just the popular thing at the time. But I kept thinking about that when you're pointing out these formulas, that we expected that these formulas would give us certain outcomes and how we do not need to have control over our outcomes to thrive, and that surrender is seldom applauded, particularly in the Christian subculture. I love how you state, we commingle the American dream with what we know as a biblical ethic until our spiritual identity becomes how perfectly we parented our children. The measure of that quote, quote, perfection is the playing field of adulthood where our children stumble and echo out their living. And that's very relatable, especially in the homeschool community. So can you share more of the 3 words that are the title of this book and how that is the key going forward with parenting our adult children?
Well, I think a lot of us who are experiencing parenting adult children for the first time, our 3 words are crying, control, and sadness. So,
that's real.
Yeah, this kind of out of control feeling.
Yep.
But our role, obviously, when your kids leave the nest, your role changes. And when they hit 18 and they're called adults by our government, then they have their own will and their own way. And so truly, the only thing that we can do is love them, pray for them, and listen to them. Now, I do know that there are some kids out there who have ghosted their parents, who have walked away from their parents and refused to talk to them. And in that case, you can't listen, but you can always love and pray. Yeah. And so that's, if you're looking at, well, what can I do? I can't fix this problem. They're making these decisions that are going to affect the rest of their lives. That's right, because they have their own life, just like you had your own life in your 20s, and you made mistakes, and those decisions affected the rest of your life too. You have autonomy, they have autonomy, but you can always create the kind of home that your child is wildly enthusiastic about coming home to. You can always get on your knees and pray for them. And if they do come home to you, you can listen. We have some of our kids are wayward, and one of them recently has gone through a huge tumult in their life and like a really big mess. And we were the first person that child called, and we were the soft landing place for that child. And so I feel like in some ways, all that work of creating a haven-like home, even though we disagree on almost everything, we were the first call.
Mm-hmm. That's comforting.
Yeah.
That's what you want.
Yeah, that's happened to me several times too. Yeah, I'm just processing everything you said. You say how Paul uses the word patient is a different meaning based on how we react when people provoke or act unjustly towards us. You say it's a relational patience of the highest order, the kind that enables us to love our enemies and to be gracious to those that harm us. It expresses persistence and an unswerving willingness to await events rather than try to force them. Can you share more about that?
Sure. And I think, when we are in provocation with our adult kids, if we have different views on things, I think our first fallback or our first reaction is to correct, because we've been in those places with our kids when they were little. And when they had a weird opinion or they thought wrongly about something, it was our job as parents to correct them and to say, no, that's actually not what that means. Or, that's our first fallback. And so when we are provoked verbally, our first response typically is, well, I'm going to correct them because it's my job as the parent. And yet here we see Paul saying, no, actually, you're not easily provoked. You are to have a relational patience and to err on the side of relationship, which does mean to listen more than we speak. And there's plenty of verses throughout the Old and New Testament that talk about listen more than speak and listen a lot longer than you speak, and to really hear the other person. And that to me is something we've lost in today's world in these social media spaces of time of just like jabs and sound bites. And it's all about someone winning and someone losing. But I have found that when I ask my kids questions, even if I don't agree with them, we can almost always, in a conciliatory way, find ways that we have similar beliefs. If you kind of pull away at the, maybe the political opinion or whatever opinion that they have, if you pull away at it, underneath all that, there's usually something that you can find some common ground on. But we're just not trained to do that anymore. And I think that's sad.
Yeah, that's so true. And that made me think about, I was with my oldest son this weekend and we were in the car talking and I was on some rant about something because I'm such an advocate about things. And I was talking about some situation that was so unjust and I was kind of ranting and ranting. And then I looked over and he was sharing something with me and I kind of I didn't interrupt him, but I, ended up sharing my rant. And I looked over and I thought I totally shut him down. And here he was telling me something, sharing something and where I can really see where he's coming from. And it made me stop and go, yeah, I need to, like you're saying, it's not my job to rant and give him all my opinion on it. I need to be more focused on listening to what he has to say.
Yeah. And I think there's such a big struggle with, you raise your children, just like you said, and they listen to you and you're supposed to give your opinion. Then you're supposed to teach them right from wrong. And then all of a sudden they're grown up and the whole dynamic is completely different. And I notice I'm struggling with that a lot. So this is what everything you're saying and writing this book is just so great. Really. I mean, I don't think people talk about this. I've never heard anyone talk about this before, but now I'm experiencing it. And I'm like, wait, we need to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this quote from your book. It says, when I've been tempted to control my adult kids or when so many helpful advice threatens to escape the confines of my mouth, like I was talking about.
Yeah.
I'm learning to direct those words toward the Lord rather than my kids. To love our children with patience is to pray. Take all that energy you have in wanting to control your kids to the foot of the cross and surrender. The truth is you cannot control another person. If you try, you border on enslavement. Not even our Heavenly Father does such a thing. He grants all his children free will, so we must do the same. And I love that verse. I mean, I love just free will. I mean, that's so true. We all have free will. I had free will. God didn't force himself on me. And that's what actually made me want to become a Christian as I read this book called Ask Him Anything. And he talked about free will. And I was like, wow, that's true. God could have made us all robots that were all automatically come out of the womb, with that. But no, he wants relationship. And so I love talking about free will because I think that's what makes God love is not forceful. So anything else you want to share about free will?
Well, we see it obviously in action in the Garden of Eden. And, he really truly he could have even intervened, could have run into that situation and said, hey, don't listen to that snaky person. He could have done all that. And yet he stood back and allowed them to exercise their free will. And it is really encouraging for me to know that God had wayward adult children and he was the perfect father, because I think there's a lot of shame in our community, especially in the Christian community. We feel this shame like, oh, if I had raised my kids right, they wouldn't have walked away or they wouldn't have made this choice or done this, when we forget that the perfect parent of the whole universe also had his children walk away in a pretty, spectacular way, like imparts sin to the whole human race. So he understands. And that's why I love the fact that we have this father we can run to who empathizes with us. He knows what it's like. And think about the grief of God. Every single human being that he's ever created has rebelled against him. Every single one. So sometimes I just think about the grief of God. And then I know he understands parental grief when our children do things that we don't appreciate.
Yeah, that's so true. And he understands when they're not looking to him. He feels that grief more than we do.
I never thought about that with Adam and Eve not listening.
Yeah.
Our kids do. Well, I never really ever thought about that. Well, you say Ray Pritchard coins a phraseology, sweet usefulness, and how the surrounding pagan culture at the time was wooed to Christ by Christians known for those who are made of kindness. You say God has that same character trait towards us, and that we are to emulate his kindness because kindness is contagious. It is rare and it is compelling. An act of kindness can soften the hardest of hearts. You ask, is judging our kids going to draw them toward Jesus?
When I think about that, I'm teaching on this in my life group at church. So every week I'm teaching on some of these things. And last week I talked to them and said, think about a relationship that you cannot wait to see. So it could be a friend, a relative, a family member or whatever. And think about what is it about them that irresistibly draws you to them. And almost always you can tell them anything and they're going to love you anyway. And it doesn't mean that they're going to applaud your acts of sin or anything. They're the kind of friend or person that will say, hey, you're really messing up here. But when they say it, you don't take it negatively because you're so very loved. And yet think about the people that you don't want to be around. And I had a recent experience in the last year where I was in this very untenable situation where I was constantly being judged. And I felt like a 2-year-old toddler that had like this anxiety attack every time I was in this person's presence. And I don't want to be around people like that. It's crazy making. And so as parents, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of relationship do we want to have with our child? And will they perceive us as being kind-hearted? And will we be that kind of irresistible person that they're drawn to, even if they don't agree with us?
Yeah,
That's good.
that's what we want. That's our desire.
Yeah.
I could really relate how you say you were deeply impatient with your own frailty and how you were kinder to others than you are to yourself, because I'm totally like that. I have a new job right now, and that's one thing I feel like is the test of my new job is I have to constantly, because they keep telling me, no, we know this is a lot and just it's just going to take some time. But I find myself just wanting to bawl because it's frustrating to not know what you're doing. But my day will be good if I don't beat myself up, and it'll be bad if I am beating myself up, which is more bad days than good. But I love how you say not extending kindness to myself indicates that I must have a very small view of God's outrageous grace. That was very convicting when I read that. Can you share how that helped you lighten up on yourself and be kinder to yourself?
Well, I will say that I am in the trenches with you, and this is really hard for me, and that I'm still walking this out with fear and trembling for sure, because I think because we're in our own heads, we know ourselves really, really well, and we know all of our frailties. And for whatever reason, we think that it's up to us to create perfect people for the Lord to love, even though we don't treat other people that way. I don't know why, but I think it's just because we know ourselves so well. But I have to believe, and what helps me is reminding myself of the truth that the Lord is for us, that he has sent his son to die for us, that there is nothing that can separate us from his love. And even ourselves, we cannot separate ourselves from his love, because his love extends beyond our failures, our mishaps, our messes. And so I think part of this journey is just reminding ourselves of the truth.
That's so true.
Yeah. I love that we're talking about kindness, because that's been on my heart for a while now, and a lot of how the world is just not quite as kind as it used to be. And it does really change a person's day, just a small act of kindness. So you share how, while we may not be able to control what our adult kids say to us, we can control our ability to speak life over them. Can you expound on the importance of that?
Yeah, I think as parents in the 0 to 18 years, we have been kind of conditioned to correct. And I would like us to shift at that moment when our kids become adults to look for the good. There was a study by the Gottman Institute in the state of Washington, the University of Washington, that looked at what were the greatest tenets of a great marriage. The number one predictor of whether a marriage would survive or die was whether the spouse assumed positive intention of the other. And I think that's where we fail. We're so used to picking apart that we can't find the beauty in front of us. And so my encouragement to parents of adult kids is catch them being good, even if it's something small, and tell them out loud, or write them a note, or text it to them, or give them a voicemail and say, you know what? I just see you working so hard, and I'm so proud of you. I know it can't be easy to start that new job in the middle of, after leaving that other job, but I see that you're doing a really great job there, and I'm proud of you. So if we can think more about not how to correct our kids, because they do have the Holy Spirit and they do have other people in their lives as well, but how can we catch them at being good?
Yeah, I love that.
Giving more encouragement. And I need to do that more.
Hold on a minute. I got to text my kids now for a minute.
I know you just gave me
I'm a little guilt. No, you are right though. I am proud of them, but I'm not telling them.
We don't tell them enough.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
That more.
Okay.
It's just so easier to, say the negative than the positive for whatever reason.
We're in agreement here.
Yeah. Do you talk about how if we want our adult kids to hear our heart, we must first become a listener? You say, don't feign listening merely to check off a relational box, but truly seek to understand your adult children's opinion and how they arrived at it. You may find that you have the same underlying values, but the manner in which you are each tackling the world's problems is different. How is referring to our kids as neighbors rather than relations going to help us?
Well, neighbors don't necessarily have all the baggage of, I know what you did when you were 4 years old. And so when I think about my neighbors, and especially if I think about an unsaved neighbor, I'm thinking about, well, if they're sick, can I bring them some chicken noodle soup? If they're hurting, How can I be a listener? How can I provide for their needs? And if they tell me a political opinion or another opinion or even a spiritual opinion that I don't agree with, am I going to argue back with them? No, because my heart is I want to win them to Christ. And so that's what I do. So if I can think of my adult kids and kind of separate myself from knowing all that stuff about their childhood and just look at them today at face value of who they are right now, I'm much better in that mindset to know how to listen to them and to be kind to them.
Yeah, not taking it as any kind of personal attack.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
that's
the key.
good. That's good. You state that the insecure either boast, compare, or self-condemn. The secure rest. How can resting from comparisons give us more joy?
Well, as we know, comparison is the thief of joy. I can't remember who said that, but I've heard it a million times. And I tend to lose my joy when I look at other families and I'm like, oh, well, they wonder what they did because all their kids just turned out so great. And then I'm suddenly sad because my kids didn't turn out the way I wanted them to. And so instead, I'm learning just to go to the Lord and accept things as they are in the current reality in present tense and say, Lord, you are good today. You are good to me today. You love my kids more than I do. You are taking them on a journey that is more powerful than the one I would take them on. You know them better. And so I can rest from feeling insecure in my parenting. And, if there is something I've done wrong, I always have the opportunity to apologize. And so I can. And if I'm convicted, and I've done it a lot, I've apologized when they were little. I've apologized in their teens. I apologize now for things that I wish I would have done differently. And that always opens the door for more relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done the same thing because I homeschooled and I feel like early on I was legalistic. I can look back and see my legalism. And so I'm like, I'm sorry that I taught you this or I read you this book.
Mm-hmm.
I do try to keep the conversation ongoing. So I have this question that the friend that recommended this book to me, she asked, I said, do you have any questions you want me to ask her? And so this is a question that she gave me. How do I keep from getting pulled into a paralyzing, overwhelming grief over my child's lostness, since it seems against the odds that he or she will turn again to God? What can I hang on to, recite, or do to keep my heart buoyed up with hope in God's unfailing love for my sons?
I think that comes, and again, this isn't going to be a simple, neat answer, but it does rest and rise and rely on.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 with Mary Demuth. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.